Which state? Virginia. Which state board? Washington. Which state borders Minnesota? Which of these? Which of these states? The flag below Maryland. Which state? Wisconsin. Which state borders the Great Ohio? Which of Which state? New York. Which state? Pennsylvania. Which? Florida. The flag? Georgia. Which of these states? Which of the Which state? Hawaii. Which state borders the Pacific Ocean? Mississippi, South Dakota, Hawaii, Hawaii. Which state borders the Gulf of Mexico? Mississippi. Which state borders the Mississippi? Kentucky. Which state borders Washington? Which state borders North Carolina? Which of these states is Oklahoma? Which of these states is Utah? The flag below Arkansas. The flag below Rhode Island. Which state? Connecticut. Which state? Hawaii. Which of these states is Nebraska? Which state borders Alaska? Which of these? Which state borders the Mississippi? Which state borders Hawaii? Which state borders New Jersey? The flag below Montana. Which state borders Wisconsin? The flag below Idaho. Which state? Maine. Which state? North Carolina. Which state? Connecticut. Which state? Tennessee. Which state border? Washington. Which state border? Louisiana. Which state border? Massachusetts. Which state? California. Which state? New York. Which state border? Ohio. Which state borders the Atlantic Ocean? Virginia. Which state? Mississippi. Which of the Which state borders Oregon? Which state? Kentucky. Which of these Which state border? Pennsylvania. Which state border? Minnesota. Which of these states? Which of Which state borders South Carolina? Which of these Which of these states is Missouri? Which of these states Which state? Indiana. Which of these Which state? Hawaii. Which of Which state? Florida. Which state border? Rhode Island. The flag below Montana. The flag below South Dakota. The flag below Texas. Which state borders Alabama? Which state borders Mississippi? Which state borders Illinois? Which state borders Wisconsin? Which state borders Alaska? Which of these Which of these states? Which state borders New Jersey? The flag Nevada. Which of these? Which state? Florida. Which of? Which state borders Hawaii? Which of these?